is your sense that seekers as well as people within the church are after a different way of exploring the Bible? So one thing I've heard a lot of around the last 6 months, this idea that people want full fat faith. This also ties into the idea of like Christian weird. So if people are coming and exploring Christianity, you don't need to change. Like we don't need to necessarily be dialing back or being super seeker sensitive, perhaps as would have been in onboarding in the past. And I guess, interested in your reflection on to what extent do church leaders, those who are interested in mission, exploring the Bible, both perhaps people who are new to faith and those who are exploring, how deep can they go? Do we still need to think about an onboarding? How do we get people on that journey?
Yeah, what I am surprised by actually is that there is just a genuine desire to just jump in actually without too much kind of, we have to really take people on a very slow, gentle journey before we actually expose them to the Bible. And I also encounter that to some extent in younger people, and they're often the ones where we feel like we have to sort of do a bit more entertainment, before we get to the actual kind of core stuff but actually, interestingly, among, a lot of the teens I see, they just want to do Bible study. They just want to get in there and do it. It's like the church can never out-entertain TikTok or Instagram or all the things that are on offer. So I think they're actually a bit tired of being entertained to some extent. They're actually looking for something quite meaty. And so I've been encouraged by that, actually. Maybe church leaders can just be a bit more direct and invite people to just come and engage the Bible in a fairly direct way. Now, obviously, that's, you don't want to put up unnecessary barriers. And of course, having a framework, things like the Bible course I think this is a super moment for those things to come into their own and help people to start putting the pieces together. But yeah, I do sense that people are ready for it in that way. And in the wider sense, the full fat faith, I think that's reflected in, as you say, the fact that people are more interested in a more kind of weird expression of Christianity. As Tom Holland has famously said, keep Christianity weird. And when he goes to church, he tends to go for a very full-on, Anglo-Catholic, drenched in ritual and meaning, and something that completely transports him from the normal humdrum everyday world into a story. And, and that, again, that's perhaps keys into the fact that the Quiet Revival has been seeing, a real uptick in that area, the more Catholic sort of end of the church. But likewise, the same could be true, as I'm sure you're aware of, the fact that a more charismatic Pentecostal sort of expression is also gaining traction, and it's because it's different and weird in its expression. And I just think anything that just feels like the culture that we already have, with maybe a bit of spiritual sprinkling over the top of it, just doesn't satisfy, actually. That people and young people, I think, are quite intense. They're looking for something that rises above the shallowness, if you will. Both in the Bible and in its expression in Christian worship. They want something deeper and more substantial, I think.
I think that is really, this gets to the heart of the challenge the church faces, I think, doesn't it? There's a whole generation that their biblical literacy is as low as probably it's been, certainly for a long time in this country. So the starting point is minimal knowledge, but the curiosity levels are way higher, often for those who are brand new to it all, than those who've been immersed in it for some time. I'm speaking to lots of church leaders where they're saying things like, just one comes to mind in Cornwall. He was just saying that, one of the local rugby club, proper lad from captain of the rugby club, has just become a Christian through reading the Bible. Now his appetite for the Bible is almost putting to shame the apathy in the church. The church is kind of like drifting with a fairly low level occasional sermon, and this guy's asking these questions, wrestling like he would on the rugby field, but this time with the Bible. And I feel like I'm hearing that quite a bit. And so there's this challenge of how does the church meet the moment when sometimes the appetite for the Bible seems to almost be stronger outside the church than within the church. And that might not always be fair, but I just feel like there's a challenge there. One of the stories in the Bible that I've been reflecting on a lot with is the story of Philip, the evangelist, coming alongside the Ethiopian eunuch who's wrestling with the Bible, struggling to make sense of it. But the fact that Philip is ready, he knows enough to help this man who's perplexed, but really curious and open. He knows enough to help him make sense of how the big story of the Bible fits together and points to Jesus. I mean, what advice do you have for, I suppose, how can the church meet this moment, especially in particular with the Bible, but more generally as well? What are we needing to do to not miss what's happening?
I think that there's lots of different directions I could go in here, but one of the things I think is to encourage, but firstly, those who are already in the church to pick up their Bibles again, because I think you're right. There's almost a sense in which I've suddenly I've been like, well, have I paid as much attention actually recently to the Bible as you know, these new young sort of people who are taking this interest in. I think the church also, though, you know, has to take seriously its role of, you know, helping people to engage the Bible and understand it. And this is the great difficulty, is in the age of social media, there are all kinds of takes on the Bible that people can easily pick up. And how does the church sort of compete, in a sense, with the wide variety and very often sometimes sadly erroneous or sub-biblical kind of ways in which people can use and abuse the Bible? So I think sort of doing everything we can to kind of give people opportunity to read the Bible, to discuss the Bible, and to sort of engage it in ways that are really helpful. One of the dangers you see, I think, that we're seeing is there's a lot of talk about the Bible and biblical values, but not that many people are necessarily actually ending up reading the Bible. And this was an interesting reflection from my friend Glenn Scrivener, who I'm sure you guys may know. We were both at the ARC conference earlier this year. And for those who aren't aware, that's a sort of interesting new sort of conference movement that has emerged partly under the auspices of Jordan Peterson and others, where they're trying to kind of sort of bring together a sort of conservative political movement with a kind of a reintegration of Christian values and Christendom. And there are things that are good and things that are potentially bad about that. I did a whole episode of my podcast this season, you know, with my reflections and some highlights from this conference. But one of the things Glenn Scrivener said, who was also there, is he said, he found it so interesting because in the sort of whatever the onstage speakers were saying, in the venue, in the sort of stalls, you know, in what was probably, I don't know, a 50% Christian, 50% non-Christian sort of mix, everyone seemed to want to talk about faith and the Bible, and it was so easy with all these non-Christians there to strike up a conversation about the Bible. And he said, what I really should have done is just bought some Bibles and handed them out, because he said, you know, let's stop talking about biblical values and just read the darn thing, because he feels like there's a sort of sense in which it's very easy to kind of start to use, quote unquote, the Bible or biblical values or whatever it might be for a agenda, when people have never actually gone to the trouble of really understanding the story in its full breadth and what it actually means for our lives and how we go out and live in the world. So that for me is really important, that the church, in its excitement and perhaps enthusiasm that people are talking about the Bible again and biblical values, don't lose sight of the fact that people actually need to engage the story at a deep level to understand it, because that's what will actually transform their lives and transform culture, not just some sort of veneer, if you will, of feeling like it's culturally fashionable right now to talk about the Bible and so on.